Sometimes the smallest cry can change an entire life. Ethan Walker could barely see through the snow. The storm had swallowed the Colorado mountains in a wall of white, turning the familiar forest into a maze of shadows and swirling ice. Wind pushed against him with relentless force, driving needles of snow across his face and freezing every exposed inch of skin. Yet he refused to stop. A few feet away, Ranger stood firm in the storm. The aging German Shepherd's sable coat was covered in frost, his amber eyes fixed on something hidden beyond the curtain of falling snow. Ethan followed the direction of the dog's gaze. At first, he heard nothing, only the howl of the wind weaving through the pine trees. Then it came again, a sound so faint it barely seemed real. A tiny cry, weak, fragile, almost swallowed by the storm. Ethan's heart tightened. He looked down at the small bundle resting inside his arms. A German Shepherd puppy no larger than a football lay wrapped inside his winter jacket. The little body was cold, far too cold. Its breathing was shallow, barely noticeable. Ethan pulled the puppy closer to his chest, trying to share what warmth remained inside him. "Come on, little one," he whispered. "Stay with me." The puppy did not respond. Ranger stepped closer and gently nudged the bundle with his nose. The old dog let out a soft whine. It was a sound Ethan had heard only a handful of times during the years they had spent together. Concern, urgency, hope. The forest around them felt endless. Snow-covered pines stretched in every direction. Darkness had arrived early beneath the thick storm clouds. The trail back to the cabin was nearly impossible to see. Yet Ranger remained focused on something ahead. Another cry drifted through the storm. This one sounded farther away. Ethan froze. He slowly turned his head toward the sound. The puppy in his arms could not have made that noise. Which meant one thing. There were more. A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the weather. Ranger immediately moved forward. Not running. Not panicking. Purposeful. Certain. The German Shepherd glanced back once as if making sure Ethan was following. Then he pushed deeper into the forest. Ethan stared after him. Every survival instinct told him the storm was becoming too dangerous. The wind was stronger than before. Visibility had dropped to only a few yards. Temperatures were falling fast. Yet the cry came again. Tiny. Helpless. Waiting. Ethan looked down at the puppy nestled against his chest. Then he looked toward Ranger disappearing through the snow. Something told him the dog already knew where he was going. "All right, buddy," Ethan said quietly. "Lead the way." Ranger moved ahead. Ethan followed. One man. One old German Shepherd. One fragile life fighting to survive. And somewhere beyond the storm, hidden beneath the snow-covered wilderness, a discovery waited that would change all of their lives forever. 3 hours earlier, the storm had not yet arrived. The mountains stood silent beneath a blanket of gray clouds, and the last light of afternoon filtered through the towering pines surrounding Ethan Walker's cabin. Smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney. Inside, a fire crackled warmly, filling the room with the scent of cedar and old wood. It should have been an ordinary winter evening, but Ranger would not settle down. The aging German Shepherd paced from one end of the cabin to the other, back and forth, back and forth. His nails clicked softly against the wooden floorboards. Every few moments he stopped beside the front door and stared at it, waiting, listening. Ethan sat in a worn leather chair near the fireplace with a book resting on his lap. At first he paid little attention. Ranger had always been alert. Years of training had shaped instincts that never truly disappeared. Yet something felt different today. The dog was restless in a way Ethan rarely saw. "What is going on with you?" he asked. Ranger immediately turned toward him. His amber eyes locked onto Ethan's face. Then he looked back at the door. A soft whine escaped his throat. Ethan frowned. "Need to go outside again?" Ranger's tail remained still. He stepped toward the door. Stopped. Looked back. Waiting. Ethan closed his book and watched him for a moment. Outside, snowflakes had begun drifting down from the darkening sky. The weather report had warned of a major storm arriving before nightfall. Visibility would drop. Temperatures would plunge. It was not the kind of evening to wander through the forest. "Not tonight, buddy." Ranger did not move. Another soft whine. Then he placed one paw against the door. Ethan sighed and stood. "All right." He opened the door. Cold air rushed into the cabin. Ranger stepped onto the porch and immediately looked toward the tree line. His ears stood high. His body stiffened. He was listening for something. Ethan followed his gaze. Nothing moved among the snow-covered pines. No deer. No elk. No sign of trouble. Only silence. Yet Ranger continued staring into the forest as though he could hear a voice carried by the wind. Several minutes passed. Snow began falling harder. Finally, Ethan called him back inside. Ranger obeyed, but reluctantly. Once the door closed, he returned to pacing. Window. Door. Fireplace. Door again. The behavior continued for nearly an hour. Ethan tried reading. Tried making dinner. Tried ignoring it. None of it worked. Ranger remained focused on something beyond the walls of the cabin. Then, just as darkness settled over the mountains, the German shepherd suddenly froze. Completely still. His ears lifted. His eyes widened. A second later, he rushed to the door and let out a low, urgent whine unlike anything Ethan had heard in years. Every instinct inside the former Navy SEAL immediately awakened. Because Ranger was not asking to go outside. He was trying to tell him something. The moment Ethan opened the door, Ranger exploded into motion. Not reckless. Not wild. Focused. The old German shepherd raced off the porch and headed straight toward the forest. Snow crunched beneath his paws as he disappeared between the pines. Ethan grabbed his winter jacket, flashlight, and gloves without hesitation. Years of training had taught him to trust instinct, especially when it came from a partner. And Ranger had been his partner long enough to earn that trust. The cold hit immediately as Ethan stepped outside. The temperature had already dropped well below freezing. Snow drifted across the ground in long white ribbons pushed by the wind. Ranger stood 20 yards ahead waiting for him. The moment Ethan started walking, the dog turned and continued deeper into the woods. They moved steadily beneath towering pine trees. Branches heavy with snow swayed overhead. The fading daylight painted the forest in shades of gray and blue. At first, Ethan saw nothing unusual. Then Ranger abruptly slowed. His nose lowered toward the ground. The German shepherd began following a path invisible to human eyes. Ethan swept his flashlight across the snow. After several moments, he noticed something. Tiny tracks. Small paw prints scattered across the white surface. Fresh enough to identify. Old enough to worry him. Ethan crouched down for a closer look. The prints were canine. Very young canine. His heartbeat quickened. Ranger continued forward. The trail wound between the trees, weaving deeper into the mountains. Snowflakes landed on Ethan's jacket and melted against the warmth of his body. The forest grew quieter the farther they traveled. Even the wind seemed muted beneath the thick canopy of pines. Ranger never hesitated. Every few yards he checked the scent again, then moved forward, as if following a map only he could see. Nearly 30 minutes passed. The trail climbed a shallow ridge before descending toward a narrow valley. Darkness settled around them. The storm clouds above blocked what little sunlight remained. Ethan switched on his flashlight. Its beam cut through the growing gloom. Ranger suddenly stopped. Completely still. Ethan froze beside him. The German shepherd's ears stood high. His body tensed. Listening. Ethan held his breath. At first he heard nothing. Then a sound floated through the forest. So faint it could have been mistaken for the wind. A tiny cry. Weak. Trembling. Alive. Ethan's stomach tightened. The cry came again. Ranger immediately surged forward. The old dog moved faster now. Purpose filled every step. Ethan followed as quickly as he could through the deepening snow. The sound grew clearer. Still weak. Still distant. But real. The trail ended near a cluster of fallen trees at the base of a slope. Snow had collected heavily there, creating drifts nearly 3 feet deep. Ranger stopped beside the tangled roots of a massive pine tree that had fallen years ago. He began pawing gently at the snow. Not frantically. Deliberately. Ethan approached and aimed his flashlight toward the hollow beneath the roots. The beam illuminated a hidden space buried beneath layers of snow and pine needles. For a moment, he could not understand what he was seeing. Then several tiny shapes shifted within the darkness, and everything changed. For a moment, Ethan simply stared into the hollow beneath the fallen tree. Snow drifted through the air around him, settling softly on the exposed roots and frozen earth. The flashlight beam revealed 5 tiny German shepherd puppies huddled together against the cold. Their bodies were pressed tightly against one another. Their fur was dusted with snow. They looked impossibly small beneath the tangled shelter of roots and branches. A faint whimper escaped from one of them. Another barely moved. Ethan's heart sank. Then he noticed something else. Curled around the puppies was an adult German Shepherd. Her sable coat blended into the shadows of the hollow. Even now, she seemed to be protecting them from the storm. Ethan lowered his head for a moment. The sight told a story without words. A mother doing everything she could for her litter until she had nothing left to give. The wind moaned through the trees overhead. Ranger stepped forward carefully. The old shepherd lowered his nose and gently sniffed each puppy. His movements were slow and respectful, almost as though he understood exactly what had happened here. Ethan knelt beside the hollow and reached inside. The nearest puppy felt cold beneath his gloves, far colder than any animal should feel. Yet when he carefully lifted it, he felt a tiny movement. A faint tremble. Relief surged through him. "Easy," he whispered. "I have got you." One by one he checked the others. Every puppy was alive. Barely. Their breathing was weak. Their small bodies carried only traces of warmth. The storm was getting worse by the minute. If they remained here much longer, they would not survive the night. Then Ethan found the smallest puppy. It lay slightly apart from the others near the edge of the shelter. Motionless. Silent. His chest tightened immediately. He picked it up with both hands. The puppy weighed almost nothing. Snow clung to its tiny fur. For a terrible second, he thought he was too late. Ranger moved closer and touched the puppy gently with his nose. Ethan looked down, waited, listened. Then he felt it. A faint flutter beneath the tiny chest. Weak, fragile, but there. A heartbeat. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Thank God. The words escaped before he realized he had spoken them. Ranger's ears lifted. The old dog seemed to relax slightly. Ethan removed his heavy winter coat and spread it across the snow. Working carefully, he wrapped all 5 puppies inside the insulated layers. The smallest remained closest to his chest. He could feel its fragile heartbeat through the fabric. The responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. 5 lives. 1 storm. Very little time. Snow swirled harder around them now. Darkness crept deeper into the forest. The trail back to the cabin stretched nearly 2 miles through worsening weather. Ethan looked toward Ranger. The German Shepherd was already standing, facing the direction they had come. Ready, waiting, as if he knew the mission was only half finished. Ethan gathered the bundled puppies into his arms and rose to his feet. The wind struck his face immediately. The cold felt sharper than before. Yet somewhere beneath the weight of the storm, a spark of hope had appeared. 5 tiny lives were still fighting, and he intended to fight right beside them. The journey back to the cabin felt endless. Snow fell harder with every passing minute, turning the forest into a blur of white and shadow. Ethan held the bundled puppies tightly against his chest, shielding them from the wind with what remained of his coat. Beneath the layers of fabric, he could feel their tiny bodies pressed together. Some moved faintly. Some remained frighteningly still. Ranger stayed close beside him, breaking a path through the deep snow whenever he could. The old German Shepherd never wandered more than a few feet away. Every so often he looked back at Ethan as if checking on the precious cargo they carried. The storm continued to build. Around them, wind pushed through the trees with a low, mournful howl. Snow gathered on Ethan's shoulders, his gloves, and the brim of his hat. His legs ached from forcing his way through drifts that reached nearly to his knees. Yet he never slowed. Somewhere ahead, warmth waited. Light waited. Hope waited. Nearly 40 minutes later, a faint golden glow appeared through the trees. Ethan felt relief wash over him. The cabin. Ranger saw it too and immediately picked up his pace. Moments later, Ethan pushed through the front door and stepped into blessed warmth. The scent of cedar logs filled the air. Flames danced inside the stone fireplace. The contrast was almost overwhelming. Ranger shook snow from his coat, while Ethan carefully laid the puppies onto a thick blanket beside the hearth. He immediately got to work. Towels warmed near the fire. Fresh blankets covered the floor. One by one, he gently wrapped each puppy and rubbed warmth back into their tiny bodies. Slowly, signs of life began to appear. A small whimper, a twitching paw, a weak stretch. For puppies responded. For puppies fought their way back toward warmth. But the smallest puppy remained silent. Ethan picked it up carefully. The tiny shepherd fit inside both of his hands. Its body felt slightly warmer than before, yet there was no movement. No sound. No sign that it knew the storm was over. The room suddenly felt much quieter. Outside, the wind rattled the cabin windows. Inside, only the crackling fire broke the silence. Ethan stared down at the little puppy and felt an old ache rising inside him. A memory surfaced without warning. A hospital room years ago. Soft lights. Quiet voices. A moment he had spent a lifetime trying not to revisit. Loss had a way of hiding until something small brought it rushing back. Ethan swallowed hard. Ranger walked over and rested his head gently against Ethan's leg. The familiar gesture grounded him, pulled him back to the present, back to the cabin, back to the tiny life in his hands. Ethan looked down at the puppy again. "You have already come this far," he whispered. "Do not stop now." He wrapped the puppy in a fresh warm towel and held it close to his chest. Ranger settled beside him. The fire glowed brighter. Outside, winter continued its assault on the mountains. But inside the cabin, another battle was unfolding. One far more personal. One that neither Ethan nor Ranger intended to lose. The fire burned steadily through the night. Orange light danced across the cabin walls, casting long shadows that moved gently with every crackle of cedar logs. Ethan sat on the floor beside the hearth with the smallest puppy wrapped securely against his chest. Hours had passed. Outside, the storm continued to bury the mountains beneath fresh snow. Inside, the world had narrowed to a single fragile life. The other 4 puppies were beginning to recover. One shifted beneath a blanket. Another released a tiny squeak before settling back to sleep. Their breathing had grown stronger. Their bodies were finally warm. But the smallest puppy remained silent. Ranger refused to leave its side. The aging German shepherd lay close enough that his fur brushed Ethan's leg. Every few minutes he lifted his head and gently touched the puppy with his nose. The gesture was patient, hopeful, almost protective. Ethan stared into the flames. Memories drifted through his mind like shadows. Years ago, before the mountains, before the solitude, before the quiet life he now lived, he had learned that some losses never completely disappear. Time softened them. Distance hid them. But certain moments could bring them rushing back without warning. Holding the tiny puppy in his hands awakened feelings he thought he had buried long ago. He looked down at the small bundle. "You are tougher than you look," he whispered. "You have already survived more than most." No response. Only silence. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Midnight came and went. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Ethan adjusted the blanket around the puppy and held it closer. Ranger watched, waiting. Then something changed. It was so small Ethan nearly missed it. A tiny movement beneath the towel. He froze instantly. His heart skipped. Carefully, he leaned closer. Another movement followed. Weak, barely visible, but real. Ranger was on his feet immediately. His ears lifted. His amber eyes locked onto the puppy. Ethan held his breath. "Come on," he whispered. "That is it." A tiny paw twitched. Then a faint shiver passed through the little body. Ethan felt hope ignite inside him. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to push back the darkness. He continued speaking softly. "You are safe now. Do you hear me? You are safe." Several seconds passed. Then the puppy released the smallest sound Ethan had ever heard. A tiny whimper. Fragile, weak, beautiful. Ranger stepped forward and gently licked the puppy's forehead. The little shepherd stirred again. This time its chest rose slightly, then fell. Another breath followed, stronger than the one before. Ethan closed his eyes as relief washed over him. He had faced difficult situations throughout his life. He had endured storms both real and personal. Yet few victories had ever felt this meaningful. When he opened his eyes again, he found Ranger watching him. The old German shepherd's tail moved slowly against the floor. Ethan smiled through eyes filled with emotion. "You knew," he said quietly. "You never stopped believing." The fire crackled warmly beside them. The puppy breathed again. Then again. Outside, winter continued to rage across the mountains. But inside that small cabin, a miracle had quietly begun. Morning arrived quietly. The storm had finally moved beyond the mountains, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow and pale winter sunlight. Golden light spilled through the cabin windows and stretched across the wooden floor. For the first time in nearly a day, the wind was gone. The silence felt almost sacred. Ethan had not slept much. Every few hours he checked the puppies beside the fireplace. Every few hours he made sure they remained warm and comfortable. Now all 5 rested together inside a large basket lined with blankets. Tiny sounds drifted from the bundle. Small whimpers, soft movements, gentle signs of recovery. Ranger lay nearby, watching them with the same unwavering focus he had shown since the rescue. Ethan sat at the kitchen table holding a mug of coffee. Steam curled into the air. His eyes drifted toward the window and the snow-covered forest beyond. Then they returned to Ranger. The old German shepherd looked exhausted. His muzzle seemed a little grayer in the morning light. Yet every time a puppy stirred, his ears immediately lifted. Ethan smiled faintly. You have not stopped watching them once. Ranger glanced toward him. His tail moved against the floor. Ethan took another sip of coffee and let his thoughts wander back through the previous day. Something about the timeline continued to bother him. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Ranger had known. Long before Ethan ever stepped into the forest. Long before the storm reached its worst point. The restless pacing. The constant trips to the door. The refusal to settle beside the fire. None of it had been random. Ethan set down his mug. You were trying to tell me. Ranger blinked slowly. Ethan looked toward the mountains. The puppy tracks had already been partially covered when they found them. Snow had been falling for hours before the rescue, which meant Ranger had likely caught their scent much earlier. Perhaps much earlier. While Ethan had been reading beside the fireplace, the old shepherd had been listening to instincts he could not ignore, trying to lead him toward 5 lives hanging by a thread. The realization filled Ethan with emotion. He had trusted Ranger for years, through countless hikes, storms, and lonely winters. Yet somehow the dog had exceeded even that trust. Ranger had refused to give up on animals he had never met. He had risked the storm without hesitation. Not for praise, not for reward, simply because they needed help. A sudden squeak interrupted Ethan's thoughts. One of the puppies had climbed clumsily out of the basket. The smallest one, the little survivor. Its legs wobbled beneath its body as it stumbled across the floor. Ethan watched curiously. The puppy ignored the fireplace, ignored the blankets, ignored him completely. Instead, it headed straight toward Ranger. The old shepherd lifted his head as the tiny puppy approached. Moments later, the little one collapsed beside his front paw and fell asleep. Just like that, Ranger lowered his muzzle and rested it gently beside the puppy. Ethan laughed softly. The sound filled the cabin. Warm, genuine, perhaps for the first time in a very long while. Watching the two of them together, he realized something important. The rescue had not ended in the forest. It had only begun there. Now a new story was starting, and somehow Ranger had become the center of it. The silence felt almost sacred. Ethan had not slept much. Every few hours he checked the puppies beside the fireplace. Every few hours he made sure they remained warm and comfortable. Now all 5 rested together inside a large basket lined with blankets. Tiny sounds drifted from the bundle. Small whimpers, soft movements, gentle signs of recovery. Ranger lay nearby, watching them with the same unwavering focus he had shown since the rescue. Ethan sat at the kitchen table holding a mug of coffee. Steam curled into the air. His eyes drifted toward the window and the snow-covered forest beyond. Then they returned to Ranger. The old German shepherd looked exhausted. His muzzle seemed a little grayer in the morning light. Yet every time a puppy stirred, his ears immediately lifted. Ethan smiled faintly. You have not stopped watching them once. Ranger glanced toward him. His tail moved against the floor. Ethan took another sip of coffee and let his thoughts wander back through the previous day. Something about the timeline continued to bother him. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Ranger had known. Long before Ethan ever stepped into the forest. Long before the storm reached its worst point. The restless pacing. The constant trips to the door. The refusal to settle beside the fire. None of it had been random. Ethan set down his mug. You were trying to tell me. Ranger blinked slowly. Ethan looked toward the mountains. The puppy tracks had already been partially covered when they found them. Snow had been falling for hours before the rescue, which meant Ranger had likely caught their scent much earlier. Perhaps much earlier. While Ethan had been reading beside the fireplace, the old shepherd had been listening to instincts he could not ignore, trying to lead him toward 5 lives hanging by a thread. The realization filled Ethan with emotion. He had trusted Ranger for years, through countless hikes, storms, and lonely winters. Yet somehow the dog had exceeded even that trust. Ranger had refused to give up on animals he had never met. He had risked the storm without hesitation. Not for praise, not for reward, simply because they needed help. A sudden squeak interrupted Ethan's thoughts. One of the puppies had climbed clumsily out of the basket. The smallest one, the little survivor. Its legs wobbled beneath its body as it stumbled across the floor. Ethan watched curiously. The puppy ignored the fireplace, ignored the blankets, ignored him completely. Instead, it headed straight toward Ranger. The old shepherd lifted his head as the tiny puppy approached. Moments later, the little one collapsed beside his front paw and fell asleep. Just like that, Ranger lowered his muzzle and rested it gently beside the puppy. Ethan laughed softly. The sound filled the cabin. Warm, genuine, perhaps for the first time in a very long while. Watching the two of them together, he realized something important. The rescue had not ended in the forest. It had only begun there. Now a new story was starting, and somehow Ranger had become the center of it. That evening, Ethan stepped outside onto the porch and looked across the valley. Fresh snow covered the mountains in silver light beneath a sky crowded with stars. The storm was gone. Only silence remained. Behind him, warm light spilled from the cabin windows. Through the glass, he could see Ranger still watching over the basket, as if guarding something precious. Tiny shadows moved beneath the blankets. 5 small lives that should have been lost to winter. 5 small hearts still beating because one old dog refused to ignore a distant cry. Ethan stood there for several minutes, breathing the cold air. The cabin had felt empty for so long. Too quiet. Too still. The kind of silence that grows around old grief. Yet now soft puppy sounds drifted through the walls. Small reminders that life had returned. He realized hope rarely arrives the way people expect. Not through grand victories or dramatic moments. Sometimes it arrives hidden inside the smallest acts of mercy. Sometimes it arrives on 4 paws. And sometimes the one who rescues others ends up rescuing you too. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The snow around the cabin melted a little more each day, revealing patches of green beneath the white. Streams of snowmelt trickled through the forest. Sunlight lingered longer across the mountains. Life was returning to the valley. Inside the cabin, life had already returned in full. The puppies grew stronger with every passing week. Their legs no longer trembled when they walked. Their eyes sparkled with curiosity. They chased one another through the living room, wrestled across blankets, and turned even the quietest afternoon into an adventure. Ethan often found himself laughing at moments he never expected. The cabin that had once felt empty now seemed filled with movement and sound. Yet among all the changes, one thing remained constant. The smallest puppy never left Ranger's side. Ethan eventually gave him a name. Scout. It seemed fitting. The little shepherd followed Ranger everywhere. If Ranger walked onto the porch, Scout followed. If Ranger crossed the yard, Scout hurried behind him. If Ranger stopped beneath a pine tree to watch the mountains, Scout sat beside him and stared at the horizon too, even though he clearly had no idea what he was looking for. Ranger tolerated every bit of it. The old German shepherd had become a patient teacher. One warm afternoon, Ethan stood outside repairing a section of fence while the dogs explored the property. Wildflowers had begun appearing near the edge of the meadow. The scent of pine and fresh earth drifted through the air. Ranger rested beneath a tree while the puppies played nearby. Scout, however, remained focused on only one thing, learning from Ranger. Ethan watched as the little shepherd attempted to imitate the older dog. When Ranger sat upright and scanned the distance, Scout immediately copied him. When Ranger slowly walked the perimeter of the property, Scout marched beside him with exaggerated seriousness. The sight made Ethan smile. "You have yourself a student," he said. Ranger glanced toward him before looking back at Scout. The puppy seemed proud simply to be noticed. As the weeks passed, the bond between them only deepened. One morning, Ethan opened the front door and stopped in surprise. All 5 young shepherds sat outside in the sunshine. Ranger sat in the center. The puppies formed a crooked line around him as though attending a lesson. Scout sat closest of all. The image was so perfect, Ethan laughed out loud. Then Scout stood, walked directly to Ranger, and gently pressed his head beneath the older dog's chin. Ranger lowered his muzzle and rested it on top of the puppy's head for a brief moment. The gesture lasted only seconds. Yet something about it touched Ethan deeply. Standing there beneath the spring sunlight, he realized the rescue had become far more than a single act of survival. Ranger had not simply saved 5 puppies from a storm. He had given one of them a hero to follow. And in doing so, he had given the little shepherd a future filled with purpose, trust, and love. By early summer, the mountains looked completely different from the day Ranger first led Ethan into the storm. Green covered the slopes. Wildflowers painted the meadows with color. Warm sunlight stretched across the valley from dawn until evening. The world felt alive again. The cabin felt alive too. The 5 young shepherds had grown quickly. Their paws seemed too large for their bodies. Their curiosity seemed endless. Every morning began with the sound of them racing across the yard. Every evening ended with them gathered somewhere near Ranger. Yet Scout remained the closest. Wherever the old German shepherd rested, Scout was never far behind. One evening, as the sun drifted toward the horizon, Ethan sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea beside him. The air smelled of pine and fresh grass. A gentle breeze moved through the meadow. Ranger lay beneath the porch steps while the younger dogs explored the property. Scout rested against his side. The sight made Ethan smile. Months earlier, this place had felt empty. He had spent countless evenings sitting alone with memories he preferred not to revisit. Silence had filled every room. Some wounds had followed him into the mountains. Some losses had remained hidden beneath the surface no matter how much time passed. But now, laughter seemed to live here again. Not human laughter. Something better. The joyful chaos of life returning where sorrow once lingered. Ethan watched the puppies chase one another through the grass. Then his eyes settled on Ranger. The old shepherd's muzzle had grown even grayer. His movements were slower now, yet there was still quiet strength in him. Still purpose. Still the same loyal heart that had refused to ignore a cry buried beneath the snow. As if sensing Ethan's gaze, Ranger lifted his head. Their eyes met. No words were needed. None had ever been necessary between them. Ethan raised his glass slightly. A small gesture of gratitude. Ranger's tail moved once against the grass. Nearby, Scout stood and climbed onto the porch. The young shepherd walked directly to Ethan and rested his head on his knee. Ethan laughed softly and scratched behind his ears. Moments later, Scout returned to Ranger and settled beside him again. The younger dog had chosen his place in the world, beside the one who saved him. The sun slipped lower behind the mountains. Golden light washed across the meadow. Fireflies began appearing among the wildflowers. One by one, the puppies gathered around Ranger until all 5 lay resting near him. The old shepherd sat quietly in the center, watching, protecting, teaching. Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked out across the valley. Peace settled over him. Deep, genuine, lasting. He finally understood something the mountains had been trying to teach him all along. Healing rarely arrives all at once. It comes in small moments. A loyal companion. A second chance. A life worth saving. Sometimes a miracle begins with a faint cry in the distance. Sometimes it arrives on 4 paws. And sometimes the heart that rescues others ends up rescuing you too. Beneath the first stars of summer, surrounded by lives that almost never had the chance to exist, Ranger closed his eyes and rested peacefully among the family he helped create. And for the first time in many years, Ethan felt completely at home.